Good evening, everyone. Dr. Marvin McMickle, President Professor of Church Leadership, Director, Program of Black Church Studies. Born Chicago, Illinois in 1948, Dr. Marvin A. McMickle is a 1970 graduate of Aurora University in Illinois with a BA in philosophy. His alma mater also awarded him the degree of Doctors of Divinity in 1990. He earned a Master's of Divinity degree from Union Theological Seminary in New York City in 1973 and did 2 additional years of graduate study at Columbia University in New York City. He earned a Doctor's of Ministry degree from Princeton Theological Seminary in Princeton, New Jersey in 1983. He was awarded the Doctor's of Philosophy degree from Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio in 1998. He was also awarded the Doctors of Humane Letters by Payne Theological Seminary in Wilberforce, Ohio in 2010. He is a 2012, Dr. McMickle was named a Princeton Theological Seminary Distinguished Alumnus. He was ordained to the Christian ministry in 1973 at Abyssinia Baptist Church in New York City, where he served on the pastoral staff from 1972 to 1976. He served as the pastor of St. Paul's Baptist Church of Montclair, New Jersey from 1976 to 1986. During those years, Dr. McMickle served on the adjunct faculty at Fordham University, Princeton Theological Seminary, New Brunswick Theological Seminary, and New York Theological Seminary. He also taught biblical studies courses outside of Ossining Correctional Center, also called Sing Sing, in Ossining, New York, between 1982 and 1984. Dr. McMickle served as the senior pastor of Antioch Baptist Church in Cleveland, Ohio, from 1987 to 2011. During that time, he led the church in establishing a ministry for people infected with or affected by HIV/AIDS. This ministry was the first of its kind in the entire country. The church also offered ministries in areas of job training, a hunger center, 3 AA units, a credit union, and over $2 million in assets, and a tithing program in which the congregation tithed out to the community 10% of its annual income every year. During his service at Antioch, 14 men and women were licensed or ordained into the Christian ministry. In May of 2011, he was elected to be the 12th president of Colgate Rochester Cruiser Divinity School in Rochester, New York. Before arriving in Rochester, he was a member of the Board of Trustees of Cleveland State University in Cleveland, Ohio. Dr. McMickle was also the professor of homiletics at Ashland Theological Seminary in Ashland, Ohio, from 1996 to 2011. Upon retiring from Ashland Theological Seminary, the faculty named him Professor Emeritus, and he is the author of 14 books, and these are some of his book titles: Battling Prostate Cancer, Getting from Why Me to What Next, which was published in 2004. A Time to Speak, How Black Pastors Can Respond to the HIV/AIDS Pandemic, which was published in 2008. Where Have All the Prophets Gone? Reclaiming Prophetic Preaching in America, published in 2006. Caring Pastors, Caring People, Equipping Your Church for Pastoral Care, which was published in 2011. He has also authored dozens of articles that regularly appear in professional journals and magazines. His writings also appear in Feasting on the Word and Preaching God's Transforming Justice, 2 recent preaching commentaries. He is a member of the Martin Luther King Jr. International Board of Preachers at Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia. In the winter semester of 2009, he served as a visiting professor of preaching at Yale University Divinity School. Dr. McMickle has been married to Peggy Lorraine Noble since 1975, and they have 1 son, Aaron, who resides with his wife in New York City, and he's also a recent grandfather. Dr. McMickle first met Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1966, when Dr. King, along with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, went to Chicago to participate in the Chicago movement. Dr. King wanted to aid Chicago activists in making voting more inclusive for all residents and to ensure that housing discrimination was outlawed. The Southern Christian Conference activities in Chicago helped to initiate the Civil Rights Act of 1968. Dr. King deeply inspired Dr. McMickle to engage in prophetic activity, that is, operating outside of the ivory tower or operating outside of the church's wall and helping all, including the least of thee. Whenever Dr. McMickle has ministered, just like Dr. King, he has helped his church and his surrounding community. Dr. McMickle, the college at Brockport in general, and the Department of African and African American Studies in particular, are honored to have you and receive your presentation today. Can we all give Dr. McMickle a warm welcome, please?
To President Halstead, thank you for the welcome to the campus and for your friendship and hospitality on previous days as well, and Mrs. Halstead. To Roger Kurtz and Gary Owens and Michael Boston for a very kind and generous introduction. I do want to thank Reverend Owens for that song that sets a wonderful tone for the time that we spend together. It is a real privilege for me to be here to share with all of you on this occasion when, as a university campus, you pause to remember not only a person, but to recall an historic struggle and to raise the question of whether or not the issues that were pervasive when Martin King was among us have, to some degree, gone away or simply taken on new and different shape and form. So I'm so glad to be here to share with all of you. This is just a test. This morning I was in a Panera's coffee shop, and a young woman said to me, "Are you going to be speaking tonight at the College of Brockport?" And I said, I am. How would you know that? And she said that she was a student here and was coming tonight to the presentation. Is that young woman there? She is right there. Give her a hand. I said, I'm going to look for you when I get there. And lo and behold, there she is. So thank you for speaking to me today. It was a very uplifting and encouraging thing. I want to begin by calling your attention to what I think is one of the most significant books that describes the history of the American Civil Rights Movement. It is entitled The Origins of the Civil Rights Movement, and it was authored by Alden Morris, who at that time was a professor at the University of Michigan. What he was trying to do in that book was identify the forces that were at work that made necessary the efforts of the Civil Rights Movement. What was the world like in 1950? What was life for African American people like in 1940? How did it feel to be black in America in 1930? What were the opportunities or lack thereof for persons of color in 1920, 1910, 1890, 1880, 1870, 1800, 1760, 1720, 1690, the time the first slave ship landed in 1619. How could a system of racial segregation exist in this country for well more than 350 years? His answer was that America allowed for the existence of what in this book he called a tripartite system of oppression. Three forces, three social practices, some of them supported by law and legislation, some supported by custom and tradition, but all of them working together to create an environment in which African American life was defined and confined. Tripartite system of oppression. Point one, do everything that is possible to keep the African American population impoverished. Let poverty and a lack of any opportunity to offset that poverty be the norm. Prevent people from ever aspiring to economic upward mobility. Limit them to certain jobs at the lowest rung of the economic ladder. Make sure there are no opportunities for them to raise up their heads and even imagine a better life or a better world. The first phase of this tripartite system was deeply entrenched, smothering poverty. Reinforced by the second point, political powerlessness. Whatever you do, prevent this population from having access to the vote. Do not let them use the levers of democracy, because if they did, they might vote in ways to alter the first condition, the lack of opportunity that kept them in their impoverished state. So by whatever means necessary, keep black people from voting. Now bear in mind that by 1870, the 15th Amendment had guaranteed the right to vote, at least to all African American males. Within 20 years of the passage of the 15th Amendment, the right to vote guaranteed at the federal level was undercut by every state in the country where black folk had a large population majority, with tricks and gimmicks and terror. Sure, you can vote in Louisiana in 1895 if your grandfather voted in Louisiana in 1895, and if your grandfather could not vote because, of course, he was a slave, well, then you can't vote either. Of course you can vote in Texas if you pay a poll tax of $200 left on bond at the county courthouse. Who had $200 to leave as a bond for the right to vote in America? You want to vote in the state of Tennessee? Tell me how many bubbles are in a bar of Ivory soap? And whatever your answer was, the answer was wrong. You want to vote here? Read to me and explain to my satisfaction the words of the state constitution in the state where you live. All of this done to keep people from aspiring to vote, to keep from aspiring to break out of poverty. And when the first two failed, there was a third. Use whatever force, whatever intimidation, whatever act of terror is required to anyone who dares to imagine that their life in this country could be different. So I'll tell you a true story out of my own family experience. There was on my mother's side a man named Edward Donahue. He was born in Danville, Kentucky in 1870. At the age of 60, in 1930, he went to the county court in Danville, Kentucky, to register to vote for the first time in his life at the age of 60. The law had not changed. He was going to defy this tripartite system of oppression. He came before the registrar of voters and said, "I've come to register." He was told in no uncertain terms, and you'll pardon me if I just use the letter, that ends do not vote in Kentucky. Edward Donahue said, "Well, I've come today to try to change that. I'd like to register to vote." He was told somewhat more forcefully, "Ends cannot vote in Kentucky." Why he stayed there, I do not know. Where a man in 1930, by himself, no one with him, standing in front of the established authority of a tripartite system of oppression, could simply hold his ground because he wanted to exercise the right to vote, I'll never know. But a third time he said, "I am not leaving until I register to vote." Then the third form of oppression kicked in, because the registrar pulled out a pistol, shot him dead at the registrar's table. They took the registrar to jail. He pled self-defense. Edward Donahue was unarmed. His offense was daring to challenge the status quo. The registrar was released, went right back to the same place, undoubtedly to say to any other uppity end that came along, "Ends will not vote in Kentucky." Before you appreciate Martin King, the civil rights movement, those 4 little girls who were in that church, you have to appreciate the world that they were confronting. Unlike anything you could ever imagine if you weren't old enough to see it. Smothering poverty, total political isolation, and acts of terror that could descend upon you at a moment's notice if you ever got out of line. When America responded in 9/11 to the act of terror that hit this country, there was understandable and justifiable shock and dismay. But that wasn't the first act of terror in the history of America. Perhaps the first act of terror for Wall Street, first act of terror for those who lived and worked inside of the towers or in the Pentagon or wherever that other plane was headed when it fell in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. But it was not the first time that terror showed its face in this country. Every Ku Klux Klan rally was an act of terror. The 3,500 listed lynch mobs between 1895 and 1930 were acts of terror. Shooting Medgar Evers in the back, in the driveway of his home, in the sight of his children, was an act of terror. Blowing up a church in Birmingham, timed specifically to go off when children were in Sunday school, was an act of terror. And a little boy from my neighborhood in Chicago, who in 1955 went down to Mississippi to visit his great uncle, no one told him about the tripartite system of oppression. Nobody told him to not speak to white people. Nobody told him that you don't say anything to a white woman. He said something. Nobody knows for sure what Emmett Till said. All we know is that later that night, 3 men came to his uncle's house, demanded him, took him out from his uncle's house with no resistance. The next time anybody saw him, his body was being dragged out of a pile of mud near a river, a hole in his skull, the motor of a cotton gin tied around his neck with a piece of barbed wire, and his body so badly bloated that even his mother could not tell that it was him. No. Terror did not visit these shores the first time on 9/11. Many of us have lived with and around and as a result of terror all of our lives. It was part of a tripartite system of oppression. Now, if that system was designed to lock people into their place and keep them from ever imagining that things could be different or better, now appreciate those who either sat down or stood up. Yesterday was the 100th birthday of Rosa Parks. Please don't let that day go by uncelebrated, because she was a person prepared to challenge the tripartite system of oppression. The law said that on any public bus in Montgomery, Alabama, all white passengers can sit in the front, all black passengers sit in the back. When the white section is filled, then row by row by row, whites can move into the black section. She was not trying to integrate the bus. She was sitting in the colored section. She was subject to the tripartite system. But on this day, when she was told by a white man to give up her seat, she simply said no. And when she sat down, Martin King and a whole generation of Americans stood up. They didn't just stand up, my friends. They stood up against that system. They knew what was there. They had seen the poverty. They had lived with the absence of political power. They were well familiar with the risks of death. Martin King's home was bombed. Ralph Abernathy's home was bombed. All of them were threatened for their lives. But they kept working. Do you appreciate the fact that the people in American history that we've come to admire the most aren't the ones who made life easier for themselves by avoiding conflicts? They are instead the ones who realized all that they were up against, outnumbered, outgunned, outmanned, but committed to working for a better and more just society. Don't forget in your American history classes that the British Empire in 1776 ruled most of the world. What chance would this scraggly band of patriots have against the armies of King George? But they stood up in the face of that system of global oppression. This movie about Abraham Lincoln is sweeping across the country. These were not uncomplicated times. What he did, both as a liberator of the slaves and as one who worked to preserve the Union, he did in the face of great resistance and, we now know, great risk. Think of the people in American history who lost their lives in a struggle for freedom and opportunity to make the country and the world a better place. Tripartite system of oppression. And then when Martin King came to power, he began to redefine those three systems in a somewhat different way. So let me move now to a second set of tripartite systems. If you ever have a chance to read Why We Can't Wait or Stride Toward Freedom or Where Do We Go From Here, then these three words will become familiar. Racism, poverty, and war. For Martin King, as long as America is a country that defines itself primarily according to our racial differences, we will never be the democracy that we claim to be. Either we are all Americans together, or America has not yet reached its full potential. Now, do you think that we have won the battle of racism in America? Do you really think that race no longer matters? I give you one simple test. I was watching television on the night that President Barack Obama was giving a speech to a joint session of Congress, and a voice could be heard over on his left. Usually, when the president gives a speech, nobody speaks but the president. But on this night, there was a member of the Congress from South Carolina who wanted to express an opinion. While the president was speaking, he said about the President of the United States in a televised address before a joint session of Congress, "You lie." Now listen, even when other presidents lied and we knew it, we didn't say it during the speech. Nobody said that Reagan was lying when he was. That Bush 1 or Bush 2 were lying when they did. There was a certain respect and awe for the office. You would not dare speak that way to the president. Except this one. We're not quite sure about this one. I want to see the birth certificate for this one. The long form for this one. Donald Trump wants to see the grades of this one. The Tea Party is not sure he's not a Muslim, not this one. Even the president is not exempt from America's long, tarnished history of the assumption of racial inferiority. And as long as race matters for some, then race matters in ways that keep us as a nation from ever fully becoming all we can be. This last election was a real referendum on race in America. Mitt Romney only won one category. White men are still holding out for a view of the world that is rapidly passing away. The browning of America is happening whether people like it or not. And all of us have to learn to share the country together. But at a Tea Party convention in Arkansas in 2011, a woman could be heard with this refrain. She kept saying over and over again, Mr. President, I want my America back. I want my America back, she said. Now, of course, she said this on the day after an African-American president had nominated a Puerto Rican woman to the U.S. Supreme Court. And what she wanted back was a country where there were no black presidents and no Puerto Rican women on the Supreme Court. That was not her view of America. And Martin King said, as long as race keeps dividing us, the nation cannot go forward. And poverty, we still are a society divided as much by income and class as we are by race and color. And war. For Martin King, the issue of war was not just the rightness or wrongness of the struggle, but the costs thereof. Consider this fact. In 1965, when Martin King first spoke against the war in Vietnam, that war was costing us $500,000 a day. He said, you can't fight the war on poverty and the war in Vietnam at the same time. And if we keep fighting the war in Vietnam, then all of our national wealth will be consumed and we can't take care of our domestic agenda. $500,000 a day in 1965. Yesterday, we spent on war. Yesterday, we spent on war $500 million. Today, we spent on war $500 million. Tomorrow, we will spend on war $500 million. $15 billion a month, $180 billion a year, times 9 years, and most of our nation's wealth still is consumed by the cost, the preparation, and the consequences of war. And Martin King said we have to break this tripartite system. And now there's a third tripartite system, and I'll stop. I heard the president say this in his inaugural address. And it was as lyrical and musical a phrase as I'd ever heard. He was going right along. He was in the middle of his vision for America. And suddenly these three things all popped out. Seneca Falls, Selma, Stonewall. I paused when he said that because in one moment, the President of the United States was framing for us three of the great social challenges of our generation. Seneca Falls, the rights of women, the right to vote, the right to equal pay for equal work. Women still earn, on average, 1/4 less per dollar than men. Seneca Falls, Selma, and the ongoing struggle of civil rights in America, and Stonewall. When he first said Stonewall, I was waiting for the word Jackson to come. I said, Stonewall Jackson? Why is he discussing Stonewall Jackson? It wasn't Stonewall Jackson, it was Stonewall organization, LGBT people, persons of different sexual orientations, aspiring for equal rights and full humanity and access to all that America has to offer. And the struggle, you see, for freedom is that once your freedom has been secured, do you care about anybody else who's being left out in the cold? Seneca Falls, Selma, Stonewall, tripartite systems that keep working to keep people locked out. The challenge for this generation, as it has been for every generation, is to face whatever systems of oppression or lack of opportunity may exist. And like Rosa Parks or Martin King, sit down and say no, or stand up and say yes. But either way, let your voice be heard and your vote be counted. Thank you very much.